Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Roger Zackheim. As you just heard, I'm the director of the Reagan Institute, the D.C. office of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation Institute, and hope you all have been enjoying this reception for Kristin Carlucci-Weed's book launch, which we're excited to host here this evening. I want to extend a special welcome to Kristin's mother and Secretary Carlucci's widow, Marcia Carlucci, and Kristin's husband, Mr. Joshua Weed. Thank you so much for being here this evening. I also want to welcome the chairman of the Reagan Presidential Foundation Institute, Mr. Fred Wine. Thank you so much for being here this evening. Thanks, Fred. Well, here we are recognizing Kristin's work for the publication of Get Me Carlucci. And this release is really near and dear to our hearts here at the Reagan Institute because Kristin's father, Secretary Carlucci, had an outsized impact on the Reagan administration, serving in a variety of roles both terms. Now, before serving in the Reagan administration, Frank Carlucci enjoyed an illustrious and diverse career in the Foreign Service, in Cold War hotspots really across the globe in the 1960s. He was a political appointee in the Nixon and Ford administrations. He was ambassador to Portugal during a particularly tumultuous period of time. He was deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency during the Carter years, and he was Caspar Weinberger's, Reagan's first Secretary of Defense, his deputy in the Department of Defense during the first term, and then served as President Reagan's National Security Advisor and then Secretary of Defense in the second term. A resume unlike really much anyone else. Few could compare to what Secretary Carlucci did during those years of government service. Now, Secretary Carlucci is remembered here at the Reagan Institute as one of the most accomplished and longest-serving figures from the Reagan administration. And he was a consummate public servant, what Secretary Weinberger called, quote, a hero among civil servants, devoted to service, hard work, and statesmanship, which of course is unusual in this town. He got things done, as we were just discussing. So, we'll talk about all of this and more. Please join me in welcoming Kristin Carlucci-Weed to the stage where we engage in discussion on Get Me Carlucci. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Roger. Thank you.
Well, to our viewers on C-SPAN, here's the book, Get Me Carlucci. We'll do the most important thing I could do for you this evening and tell everybody to go on Amazon and purchase this book.
Right now.
Now that we've dispensed with the most important business for the evening, we can all go back to the reception. Just kidding. We'll have a conversation first. It's a great title. And it's, I think, an even better story behind it with a Washington Post story. Right soon after your father became Deputy Secretary of Defense. And they're trying to explain who indeed is this person that is just become the nation's Deputy Secretary of Defense. And what did they find out in that article, Get Me Carlucci?
Yeah. So the title is from that Washington Post article from 1981. My dad had just served in the Carter administration and was easily confirmed into the Reagan administration. And in this Washington Post article, they say that Nixon, Reagan, Kennedy had all said, who is this guy? Get me Carlucci. Everybody is asking for him. And that's basically what this book is about. It's about identifying the traits that make my dad so wanted, so desired in this town. A consummate, professional, skilled public servant that everybody wanted in their corner, Republicans, Democrats, even though he was a Republican, but that he got things done. So I thought it was a very appropriate title.
Absolutely, and in that image at the beginning of the story of President Kennedy, who's Carlucci? Get me Carlucci, right? And your father's sitting, I think, in Foggy Bottom having lunch with colleagues, and next thing you know, he's kind of brought in into the White House to meet someone who was a statesman from the Congo.
He had just come back. He was a Foreign Service officer, and he had served in the Congo. And he'd come back to Washington. He was having lunch. Oh, this is not working. He was having lunch. Oh, that's better. a minister from the Congo was sitting down with President Kennedy. And this minister, who my father had known in the Congo, because during that period of Congolese independence, my father had gotten to know everybody in the Congo. And this minister in the Congo says, with President Kennedy, "Où est Carlucci?" which is, where is Carlucci in French? And President Kennedy says, "Who the hell is Carlucci and why is he not here?" So his chief of staff, Kennedy's chief of staff says, "Go find this guy. You need to go find this guy, Carlucci." So my dad says he thinks he was shuffling suitcases in Blair House at the time. So they pull him in, and he's asked to translate for President Kennedy and the minister from the Congo. In the end, he says he didn't do a very good job, so he was never asked to translate again.
He did a great job capturing that. It was, I think the next time he translated for someone may have been President Reagan or something, but yeah, it was someone spoke in a paragraph and he translated it with 3 words, I believe.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Let's take a step back for a second, because this is such a unique way to write it effectively as a biography. You have a memoir that your father kept, but obviously never published. You were around for important parts, but not all of his life in public service. And you really got to know your father in a different way through this project. So share a little bit about that background, about the memoir you found, and kind of how you came to discover your father a bit through this journey.
Sure. So it is a very unusual way to write a book. My father was so humble. He was not prone to self-aggrandizement, and he thought the idea of writing a book was absurd. But in the final years of his life, he considered me the writer in the family. I had a history of writing. So I was urging him to put his thoughts to paper, put his memories to paper. So he put together a small memoir of his life. And I was grateful he did. He would send me copies, drafts, and he'd say, is this good? And I'd say, yeah, that's great, Dad. Thank you. Just put it down. Put your memories down. And in 2020, like all of us, I was going through a period of transition. And I had run across this memoir again with a friend. And she read it, and she said, "I knew your dad's life was interesting. I had no conception of how interesting it was. Is this available? Is this available to buy?" And I said, "No." And that really kind of got me down this path of, okay, I need to convert it. I need to make this into something that is actually a book that people can buy. But it was missing pieces. It was missing context, and I had to fill in the blanks of the history of the time, as well as he had left out a lot of family details in his memoir, kind of assumed that only we would be reading it. So to meld 2 voices was a difficult thing to do. I became mostly the narrator, and then there was a lot of things I couldn't ask him, so I asked other people. I conducted interviews. I met with, Colin Powell before he passed away, and other contemporaries of my father's. And then, thankfully, my family likes to hoard things. So I have boxes of his papers and his photographs and newspaper articles in our basement. So it was a treasure trove of material to work from. And I was astonished at how many, for instance, newspaper articles there were about him and about this time period. So
they go back pretty far. I mean, you would expect sort of newspaper coverage from his time and a cabinet or as national security advisor, but in some ways, they were captured even from his service in the Foreign Service in Africa, for example. I want to ask you, this about the personalities here, because this book is so interesting from understanding what was happening during Frank Carlucci's career in public service, but certainly for people in Washington, D.C., the sorts of people he was engaging with and when. So I'm going to throw out some names and just tantalize everybody with how your father got to know them and when. One of my favorites, and we didn't prepare this beforehand, so I'm not violating anything here, but Dick Cheney. All right,
yeah.
Best I recall, his friend, your father's friend, Don Rumsfeld, from Princeton, is working in the Nixon administration in the Office of Economic Opportunity, and then brings in his friend.
Yeah, an intern on Capitol Hill. Yeah, so that's how he first meets him.
So your father now is the number 2 in the Office of Economic Opportunity, and he's interviewing this intern from Capitol named?
Yeah, Dick Cheney.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So you imagine, I mean, this was kind of the environment that they are getting to know each other, is that they're young Washingtonians doing these jobs in Washington. And we know a lot of these names, and this is why another reason I decided to put this together, is that we just didn't know, or I didn't have I don't think anybody had an appreciation for Frank Carlucci, which is why I brought this
So
about.
let's continue this fun. So, okay, celebrate Frank Carlucci, blame Frank Carlucci. He was responsible for bringing Dick Cheney in early on.
Yeah.
Where's really Don Rumsfeld?
No, I don't think he was.
But then you go from there, and this is one of my favorites in the story. So he's doing great in that office, and then he's recruited to OMB.
Right.
Just imagine this for everybody. The phone rings, and who's on the other end of the line? It's George Shultz.
Right.
And he says, I'd like you to come to OMB to be my deputy. And then what happens next? Does he
Right.
end up working for Schultz?
He's working for Weinberger.
Schultz gets pulled into Treasury.
Right.
And then he ends up
Working for
working for
Weinberger.
Weinberger,
Yeah. Who we had met at OEO, actually, because, Weinberger was with Reagan, and he got into a little spat with then Governor Reagan, right, at OEO. But he develops
I was going to gloss over that
yeah,
episode,
were you
but
gonna,
now that you
were
raise
you?
it,
I mean,
So context here, Governor Reagan is fighting a particular program
He
in
is.
California. He wants to kill a program in California, which your father...
said, no, I don't want to kill this program.
Yeah.
So my father finds a diplomatic way to make both things happen, which I actually think is a line that flows throughout this book. So there's a federal program that Governor Reagan wants to kill, and my dad, working at OEO, doesn't want to kill it. So he says, well, why don't we appoint a 3-judge panel in California, 2 Republicans and a Democrat, to see if this program is actually as bad as you say it is.
Yeah, because Reagan was going after this program. This was
he
an
was going
example,
after this
Governor
program.
Reagan, waste or whatever.
Waste,
right. Yeah.
And the 3-judge panel says, actually, no, this program's okay. So my dad says, well, this provides you the political cover you need to say, this independent counsel says it's okay. And it ended up funding the longest grant in this program's history. So I do think that,
Yeah, exit Governor Reagan from the stage, but
Yes.
he'll return.
Exit Governor Reagan from the stage.
In later chapters.
That's right.
All right, let's continue having this Washington personality fun, shall we? All right.
Okay.
So that we have George Shultz, don't get to work for him. He leaves, working for Caspar Weinberger as a deputy OMB.
Right.
And again, this is kind of just remarkable because here you have a career Foreign Service officer now finding himself in this number 2 cabinet level position in the executive office of the president.
Right.
And then he continues with Weinberger, right?
Right. He goes with Weinberger to HEW, and then goes with Weinberger to the Pentagon,
Right.
and he becomes DepSecDef at the Pentagon.
And now HEW, of course, is the old, what we call now Health and Human Services.
Yeah, HHS.
And then he returns, and I love this piece of the story, to the Foreign Service because Henry Kissinger, because of course, how do we talk about this period of time and not mention Henry Kissinger? So he surfaces, and he personally asked President Ford to have, well, I guess it's get me Carlucci to Portugal.
Yeah.
Tell us about what was going on in Portugal at the time and why Henry Kissinger thought that your father was a person who could address, what he needed in Portugal.
Right. So during this period of time, Portugal was transitioning. The 50 years prior, Portugal was under an autocracy. And Kissinger was extremely worried and convinced that Portugal was going to fall under communist rule. So he wanted to send tough guy Carlucci, he viewed him as tough guy Carlucci, to Portugal to change the situation. My dad, nominated as ambassador there, goes to Portugal, and and does the kind of the same things that he had done in the Foreign Service. He lands in Portugal. He is able to speak Portuguese because he had served in Brazil. So he was the first ambassador there to speak Portuguese. And he assesses the situation on the ground in Portugal and figures out, actually, no, I don't think this country is going to stay communist. I think there's going to be a democratically elected prime minister.
I just need to interrupt you.
Sure.
This is the sort of thing you don't do to Henry Kissinger at the height of his power.
Right.
You know, going and saying, actually, where you see communism as the outcome,
Right.
I see something different.
Differ.
And he did not appreciate.
No, Henry Kissinger did not appreciate that.
That
But
feedback.
my dad said, I think you're wrong. And he was pretty staunch in that opinion. And he came back to Washington and he said, I think you're wrong. And he was proven correct. And
Well, I believe Henry Kissinger said something to the effect of, well, then you do it.
yeah, then you do it.
And he did.
And he did. Yeah.
Pretty remarkable. My sense was that post as ambassador to Portugal was perhaps one of his favorite
I think so.
kind of moments in his career.
Yeah.
Obviously they went on to other more senior and perhaps consequential
Right.
roles, but that one, I don't know, some seemed to reflect to me kind of his qualities that were
Right.
able to play out. And
Well, I think, and think
lead.
about it this way. Like, for 50 years now, Portugal has been a democratic country. So his influence there, he was able to give the Portuguese the spirit and the spirit of the United States behind them, right? And so I think that was the most consequential position that he held. There were probably more higher positions. There's more higher positions
Right.
in the U.S. government, but I do feel like that that one, especially my mom was there with him. I think that one was the most meaningful. There, the residence there is now named after
yes.
him, Casa Carlucci, and
a great picture of it in there.
and the school there is named after him. So in Portugal, he is quite a well-known name. And I think that, when we think about democracy, sometimes we take it for granted. And I feel like, for the Portuguese, that was quite meaningful.
Well, I loved it because it in some ways reflected something that President Reagan
Absolutely.
held a very deep and binding point of view that people want to be free.
Right.
And wasn't ready to write them off as, okay, they're communists and take the horrible approach, bring them over. It seems to be the approach he took. And a really wonderful job in terms of giving that insight into what, that Portugal looked like during this moment of the Cold War, one I certainly hadn't appreciated. All right, well, we're done with the Ford years.
Yeah.
Enter President Carter. We go from Republican to Democrat. What does Republican Frank Carlucci do now? And he actually, before taking on his next post at the Central Intelligence Agency, there was discussion whether or not he could take on a more political post. And
Right.
his view was that it wasn't going to work, right?
Right. He comments that Carter really likes him and wants him to work at the State Department. But he laughs at that and says, there's no way I'm going to get confirmed at the State Department. So he goes and works for Stansfield Turner at the agency for a couple of years under President Carter.
So the President Carter piece is you have a great story in the book because it wasn't his first time interacting with President Carter.
No.
So not only did he deny Governor Reagan or
Yes.
challenge Governor Reagan, he also challenged Governor Carter. This is
Right.
when he was working as a deputy at Hugh
Right.
with Caspar Weinberger. Give us a little feel of perhaps maybe his political instincts were slightly off.
They were wrong then, yes, and he admits it. So yeah, I believe it was. I think you have it in front of you,
Yeah, I
but
do.
it was a Head Start program.
Yes.
And so
Shall I read the sentence?
Go ahead.
The appendix?
Yes, yes.
Well, it was great. So they were going to tell Carter that we're going to override your veto and push the program in, and Weinberger is hesitating, and this is what Frank Carlucci says. When we hung up, I turned to Cap, and here you're quoting from the memoir. A
Right.
really nice device in this book, when it's coming straight from the memoir, and said, Cap, he's a lame duck governor. You'll never hear from him again. Override the veto.
Yeah, he was wrong.
But what's remarkable about that is, our politics today, and this is a theme throughout, if you would have overrun, a governor who then became president, you would never work for them, let alone
Right.
you'd be persona non grata, they wouldn't let you in the town, right?
Yeah.
And he ends up becoming a part of that administration.
Yeah. And he ends up saying, Carter liked me. Like, he liked me. So I worked for his administration because that's what he did. He was a public servant. He always put, the public service and service to, the nation before anything else.
Well, that did come at a cost a little bit. at least with one senator, Jesse Helms, never forgave him for it,
Right.
which maybe we can move to there. And this is really one of the remarkable things about your father comes out through the book was his ability to deal with difficult, certainly strong personalities.
Right.
And I think the one that comes out brightest in the book is the relationship between Cap Weinberger and George Shultz. So just to set the scene, and maybe you can comment on it, Weinberger wants and ultimately gets your father to become his deputy.
Right.
And then soon after, George Shultz becomes the Secretary of State. And then later on, he's National Security Advisor, and he's managing these two day to day. And it came across like shuttle diplomacy. How did he do it? I mean, tell us about those relationships between Weinberger and Shultz.
Right. Well, first, how did he become National Security Advisor? When he was asked by President Reagan to be National Security Advisor, he came in and he thought that the president was going to give him accolades on how intelligent he was and how he might be a great visionary. And he said, actually, no, you were chosen because you were the only person that Shultz and Weinberger could agree on. So I think these two personalities, he knew in particular Weinberger very well. And I think, he commented quite a few times that he was able to manage these two personalities very effectively. He would get them to even, I have read later, he would get them to write down their differences, what their opinions were on pieces of paper. He would take them to the president and he would give them both to the president. And then the president would ask what my father thought. And he said, I would give it. Sometimes he wouldn't ask what he thought. And he said, I'd still give what I thought. But he was able to manage both personalities extremely effectively. And in Weinberger in particular, Weinberger, was a lawyer and often, was quick to make judgments. And my father wrote, particularly if those judgments were public, he would very rarely go back on what he said. But there was, he said, this is particular when he was DepSecDef, at the end of the day, my dad would meet with him. And he said, I would always save the contentious issues for the last thing we discussed. And he said, often I'd be able to mediate him down from what he was thinking and change his mind.
Yeah, it really comes out throughout the book that he had a intuitive sense of people and knew what made them tick and therefore could work with them and kind of go back to this theme of get to outcomes and manage and lead and certainly some of the toughest personalities. And your father writes it kind of agrees with George Shultz's assessment that Cap is a position taker and George Shultz described himself as more analytical. And again, he was able to work with the analytical mind and the position taker, the lawyer, the economist, for example, and support the president. Another personality, and we referenced it earlier, but I'd love for you to expand. He had this very close relationship with Cap Weinberger, made him a better Secretary of Defense, clearly, but also was a wonderful mentor and became close friend and confidant with Colin Powell. And you referenced before you had conversations with Colin Powell in preparing this book before he passed. Talk about that relationship, and what I love about it, it's the decades.
Right.
Kind of weaving in and out of the various roles he had. Somewhat biting humor, Colin Powell tends to look at that and says, oh, he's calling me again, bring me in. He didn't give me much choice, but clearly had deep affection and appreciation of what came from it.
Yeah, it was such an honor, and I'll always remember it, being able to interview Colin a couple of weeks before he died for this memoir. They were dear friends and had mutual admiration for each other. But one story in particular, I think, really illustrates how my father really respected and depended on Colin, and that is right after he was chosen to be National Security Advisor. This is right after Iran-Contra, so he had decided to streamline, the National Security Council, and the only person he wanted working for him was Colin Powell, who had just gotten a cush gig over in Germany and had no interest in returning. I can see you guys know this story. So So he calls Colin on the phone and says, I'd like you to be my number 2. And Colin says, well, I thought you were calling me for my congratulations, right, for your new position. He said, Colin says, I have no interest in returning to Washington. Frank, I'm here. Alma, his wife, really likes Germany. I'm commanding troops over here. I don't want to come back to Washington, D.C. He's like, really? I'm going to need a call from the president. So later that evening, my dad gets President Reagan to give Colin a call to say, we need you back here. So, he comes back.
And that relationship, of course, he was his military assistant. There was another example where
he was his,
Cap Weinberger suddenly reaches out to him, asks him to be his military assistant. I hadn't fully appreciated the years that they had worked together.
And then when they switched, I think my father was so low key. When they switch and my dad is told he's going to be Secretary of Defense, they're at this long table. And, Colin reiterates this story for me, a while back. He just passes him a note and says, congrats, you're the new National Security Advisor. And Colin reads this note, and he's like, what?
Yeah.
Like, there's no fanfare. There's no, there's none of this nonsense that seems to, accompany people nowadays. But there's just like,
And the humility of your father. I mean, I think just before that story, he recalls you recall the conversation he had with President Reagan, and he said, well, who's going to take your position? And he said, well, Colin Powell, and he'll be better at the job than I am, or something to that effect, which
absolutely.
Obviously great admiration. Let's talk a little bit, we have a few more minutes, and then we can go to questions from the audience here. I do want to talk about how your father viewed President Reagan and their relationship as well, being his National Security Advisor, his Deputy Secretary of Defense, and of course Secretary of Defense. But his time as Secretary of Defense really stood out in the memoir as coming in after Iran-Contra, as you note, years of the defense buildup and all that money going into the Department of Defense to carry out Reagan's vision of peace through strength. But he really came in and he tried to reform the place, and particularly acquisition and contracting. Right. That really came out in a way that I hadn't fully appreciated prior to reading this. Kind of expand on that as his tenure as Secretary of Defense, those 14 months.
Right. I think he was concerned about any wasteful spending. I think the other thing, when he reflected about his tenure as Secretary of Defense, one of his top accomplishments, he would have told you, was the BRAC Commission.
Yes.
Which is
base realignment
and closure. He was very concerned with not cutting personnel, not affecting the morale of people in the military, but he was aware that the infrastructure of the military could be reduced. I remember a story that, he proposed this idea of the BRAC Commission to the president, and the president, being an elected official, said, good luck with that, But it was successful. He came up with this idea of an independent commission to reduce bases and base infrastructure and to give it an up or down vote in Congress. And be able to reduce spending overall without cutting costs to military personnel.
In many respects, you write that Weinberger became the outside person engaging in foreign affairs, probably sparring with George Shultz, and your father was the one really overseeing the buildup, the programs, the budgets, and the like. So he was probably best positioned
to figure out where. I think that's right.
Well, let's take the last few moments and we'll open up to questions, just to get kind of your sense of how your father viewed President Reagan. There's a great quote from the memoir which you have here, capturing kind of different elements of President Reagan. One I really liked is, I'll read it to you. We also knew that whenever we got into trouble, interesting the sentence formulation, when we got into trouble, the staff, the administration, we could make up the cue cards and put him on television, and he could sway the day. He could bring people along like nobody I've ever known. I imagine that was a nice security blanket for a cabinet official or a national security advisor.
Right. I think he really viewed him that way. I think there was a number of things that that were helpful. I think he viewed, well, first I knew he viewed working in the Reagan administration as an honor, and he writes about that extensively. I think the second thing is Reagan was a strategic visionary, but not a day-to-day manager, which for, I think, my dad was super helpful. I think, he writes later that he had a meeting a week with President Reagan as Secretary of Defense for an hour. And he said, I don't even think we used that full hour because he was so overwhelmingly supportive of what we were doing. So he didn't have he wasn't involved in every decision, but he didn't need to be because he had the best people placed to do it, to carry out his vision.
Although it was interesting, there's a note in there, just before the excerpt I shared, that after President Reagan passed, he was surprised to see all the notes that he was absorbing.
He was absorbing it.
But still was somebody who listened a lot.
Yeah, because he wasn't quite sure about how much he was absorbing and how much he wasn't.
Yeah, and the hearing and all that.
Yeah,
there we go.
Yeah.
Last question, and then we'll open up to the audience and kind of bookend this, because where we started. Here you are, we look at this person's career, your father's career. So remarkable, spanning decades, administrations, strong personalities, difficult personalities, from Carter to Reagan. You couldn't be more different, and yet it was consistent. Bring me Carlucci, right? Do you think in America today, in Washington today, with a deep partisanship and division that we're all grappling with and regret, but it's a reality, we could ever have another Frank Carlucci?
I do not know the answer to that question, but that discussion is one of the major reasons I wrote this book, is because I feel strongly that his life is one that we should think about and remember and aspire to try to live out in some ways, even in a Washington that's not conducive to it.
Questions from the audience to give you enough prep time. The gentleman in the back over here, which please wait for the microphone. And make it a question, please, less commentary. Thank you.
Numerous successes and challenges your father faced. Is there any particular challenge that stands out above them all in the memoir and in your life that you can think of was really the most challenging?
The most challenging. I don't know if he had one particular event that was the most challenging for him. I would say if you ask me what would probably have been the most challenging for him, it's probably his earlier years in the Foreign Service. If you read the book, it sounds like you had just dropped him into the most conflict-ridden zones in the world at the time and said, do your best. So
he was a physical victim of that conflict, right?
He got stabbed in the back, right, in the Congo. So I think in terms of trying to do his best in those situations, that's probably when he had the toughest time. I don't know if he would answer that way. Maybe he'd say Washington was tougher, but at least from my personal point of view, that would probably be the case.
We have time for another question. A gentleman over here. Sure. Please wait for the microphone.
Could you comment on the issue with South Africa in the mid-'80s? Reagan was dealing with the issue of sanctions against the apartheid regime. At the same time, he recognized how important it was for the U.S. and South Africa to be close allies in the fight against communism. One of the things Reagan did was appoint the first African-American U.S. ambassador to South Africa. What role did your father play in promoting that kind of dynamic? Because it created a very interesting dynamic where the Afrikaner government was forced to confront the issue of their racist past, at the same time engaging with the United States to promote national security interests.
Yeah, that is an excellent question, one that I do not have the answer to. I'm so I'm so sorry.
We have time for one last question. Anybody in the audience have a question? Let's go to our distinguished scholar here, and standing up in the back, Professor Henry Now.
Thank you very much for a really
And make sure the
exciting
mic is on
evening.
there, Henry, please. Is it on? It's on. Okay, it's on. You're good.
This works, but I was wondering whether or not your father was ever asked or whether he discussed with the family running for public office. And if not, why not? Seems to me he had all those qualities that would have resonated well in the public arena.
Somebody told me recently that he was asked to run for Pennsylvania governor, or maybe it was Pennsylvania's congressman. But other than that, I don't know. And, you know, I was a child at the time, so if he was, it wouldn't have reached
That
me.
would have been a fantastic counterfactual. Think about that. Running, well, maybe if he was running for Senate, you know, or Wilkes-Barre.
Yeah, because
you
he was
know,
born and
yeah.
raised in Pennsylvania and still had strong roots in the area. I don't know that he had much interest in it. He had kind of the Colin Powell philosophy, but yeah, somebody did in this book tour era. Somebody did tell me that.
Well, for our viewers, if you enjoy this book launch, please stay tuned for our social media online announcements for future book events taking place here at the Reagan Institute. Everybody here, please join me in thanking Kristin Carlucci-Weed for her book, Get Me Carlucci.